Russian President Vladimir Putin has threatened to throttle Western companies still operating in Russia if they act against the country's interests, calling for a mirror response to restricted services from firms like Zoom and Microsoft. Let's take a listen.
Надо их душить. Согласен полностью. Говорю без всякого стеснения, потому что они нас пытаются душить, надо отвечать им взаимностью. Вот и все. Мы никого не выгоняли, никому не мешали. Мы предоставляли максимально благоприятные условия для работы у нас, на нашем рынке, а они пытаются нас душить. Вот коллега же говорил. И нужно отвечать им взаимностью, зеркально действовать.
Speaking at a meeting with entrepreneurs, Putin said Western companies had been given favorable conditions in Russia, but were now trying to throttle the country. He added that Russia would not welcome back companies like McDonald's, which left the country after Moscow launched its military offensive on Ukraine. Putin's comments come amid growing speculation that some U.S. firms may be considering a return, in the light of U.S. President Donald Trump's efforts to reset relations with Russia. However, so far, no major Western company has publicly confirmed plans to return. We have Andrew Laham, Professor of International Relations at Macalester College, joining us from Minnesota, USA. Thank you for joining us. Professor, how do you view the escalation in drone and missile strikes between Russia and Ukraine?
Well, it's a classic sword and shield dynamic. You develop an offensive weapon, then the other side develops a defense, and then you work around that. The Russians right now, with their Iskander missiles, drones, and their ballistic missiles are simply, in this part of the cycle, they're simply overwhelming the Ukrainians. Having said that, just remind everybody that we're talking about, with these strikes, casualties and deaths in the dozens compared to World War II, the bombing of Dresden, the bombing of Coventry, Tokyo, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the scores of thousands of dead. I think we just need to bear that in mind, that the escalation in terms of, right now in the cycle, in terms of Russia's ability to strike Kyiv and Ukrainians' ability to strike Moscow, frankly, is trivial, except for the families that are affected.
And it leads me to ask, do you think the international community is doing enough to respond to this escalation?
I would be hard-pressed to say that the international community is doing anything. President Trump is kind of walking away from this. He's very mercurial, as you know. The Europeans are irrelevant in terms of this, where we are in this cycle of offense and defense and drone attacks and whatnot. And you'd be hard-pressed to find any country in Africa that could care less, in Latin America that could care less. It's just not, this conflict is not on everybody's radar in the way it is in some parts of the Western world.
And building on that point that no country is doing enough, in your opinion, what role could diplomacy play in de-escalating this conflict?
Not very much, and here's why. Fundamentally, the Ukrainians under Zelensky are desperate for a ceasefire and some kind of peace because they're losing the war. On the other hand, Russia under Putin is winning the war, and they have no incentive whatsoever to end this anytime soon. Once the Russians conquer those 4 oblasts, the parts of Ukraine that they claim are Russian, with some justification, by the way, I think President Putin will draw a line under it and declare victory, and that will be the end of it. But until that happens, there's no prospect. President Trump can't broker a peace. Ursula von der Leyen usher in a peace. There's no peace to be had until Putin gets what he wants, which is not all of Ukraine, and it's not conquering all of Europe. He wants those 4 provinces, those 4 oblasts, to be incorporated practically and legally into the Russian Federation. Once he achieves that, the war's over. Until he achieves that, the war continues.
And speaking of Putin, what message do you think President Putin is sending by threatening Western companies?
Well, it's a counterstrike. There's been talk in the US and Europe about heightening or intensifying or amplifying the sanctions against Russia. And I think this is just simply a reflexive response. You threaten us with this, we'll threaten you with that. And I think that's all it boils down to. I don't think it matters at the end of the day. Either way, there's not much more the West can do to sanction Russia, and there's not much more Russia can do to kind of sanction the West. It's a bit of bloviating, to be honest.
And to sum up what you just said, how might these threats against Western firms affect international business in Russia?
Well, there isn't much Western international business in Russia. McDonald's has been, nationalized, etc. It's not going to affect Chinese trade with Russia. It's not going to affect Indian trade with Russia. And those are 2 pretty big markets and 2 pretty big sources of income. The Indians are loving the discounted oil, and the Chinese are loving the discounted cost of potash and other kind of critical minerals, if I can put it that way. I just don't see these noises that the West is making affecting the outcome of this conflict at all.
And it leads me to ask, how do you see the relationship between Russia and the West evolving in these coming months?
That's a very interesting question, and President Trump, as you know, changes his mind from hour to hour. But if I were to sort of detect a through line here, it would be this, that the US wants to disengage from Europe. It wants, so that's point A, because it wants to focus on the Indo-Pacific. B, in a related sense, what I think President Trump wants is to find a way to sever the increasingly tight relationship between Russia and China. It's kind of the reverse Nixon thing from 1972, where Nixon went to China to sever its relationship with Russia. I think he's working now to partner with Russia to sever the relationship with China. Will it work? I have no idea. My gut is telling me it's not going to work, but I've been wrong before. But I think that's the dynamic at play here. On the one hand, disengaging from Europe to focus on the Indo-Pacific, and on the other hand, trying to sever the relationship or mitigate or undermine or fracture the relationship between Russia and China. That's what I think is going on here.
And from your point of view, what is the US strategy now that more pressure or more diplomacy?
That changes from hour to hour under this president, as I'm sure you and your viewers know. Right now, at this particular moment, I think this administration has decided to put more pressure on Russia. And how did they do that? Well, they threatened the sanctions to be amplified, but they also are threatening, if I can use that word, to provide Ukraine with more weapons and more ammunition. And by the way, the United States doesn't have more weapons and more ammunition. The defense industrial base in this country is pretty much fully extended. There's not much more they can give. And what the US has been giving them, the Patriot missile system, for example, the Russians have figured out a way to use their drones so that the Patriot anti-missile, anti-aircraft system doesn't work against Russia anymore. If I were in the Kremlin, if I were Vladimir Putin, and thank God I'm not, but if I were, I wouldn't be at all intimidated or bullied or influenced by anything that the White House, any statements that the White House is issuing, and any policy changes that the White House is initiating.
Right.
He's fully committed to winning this war, which is a limited war, which has limited objectives, and there's nothing on God's green earth that's going to deter him from pursuing that.
And
Certainly nothing. Sorry, go ahead.
Since you have kind of already mentioned that U.S. has exhausted their resources in trying to stop this war, how are EU sanctions complicating any possibility of negotiations?
Well, at the point of being rude, and I try not to be, the EU is utterly irrelevant.
Well,
They've already sanctioned Russia as much as they're going to sanction Russia. There's nothing left there. There's nothing left in terms of military resources amongst the European Union members, with the exception of Poland, which is actually pulling its weight. And there's not much in the way of diplomatic, economic, or military resources that the European Union has to offer Ukraine. I think the European Union